Welcome, and my name is Philip Jackson, and I am the lead e-commerce architect at Something Digital. And I want to do a screencast for you today that's going to take you from EAV Zero to EAV Hero. And hopefully over the next few minutes, I'm going to help bring you to an understanding of what entity attribute value database schema is and what exactly it's trying to do and how Magento uses it. So let's just start off by defining what EAV means. EAV stands for Entity Attribute Value, as I already spoke about, and essentially it is an open schema design, database design, in order to allow you to have a flexible schema without requiring any sort of alteration of that schema in order to model different attribute setups for particular entities. Now, this will all become very clear and apparent. I want to walk you through how you would arrive at the decision to use EAV for a database schema. How do we wind up understanding what EAV is and does? And the way we're going to do this is we're going to draw some tables. So let's say we have a customer, okay? And our customer, we want to be able to register and purchase from our store. What are some of the things that we need to describe who our customer is? Well, there's a few things. You'll probably have a column on your database table that describes customer that has that customer's ID, okay? Maybe they have a name. Maybe that customer has an address, and maybe they have a phone number, and maybe they have a zip code, all right? So let's go ahead and let's describe a customer. Let's outline this here. So our first customer, let's say his name is John Doe, and he lives at 123 Main Street, and his number is 555-5555, and his zip code is 12345. Okay, so now we have a customer, and our customer is John Doe. He has a record in the database that describes who he is. What happens if we have a customer that comes along that's not like every other customer? Okay, so we have normal John Doe and Jane Doe, but what if we have a customer who we want to say has a little bit of a different agreement with us? We want to give that customer, him or her, a discount for every purchase that they make. So you will probably wind up creating something like the following. So let's say we have a customer, his name is Drop Shipper, that's his name. And he lives at 234 Broad Street, and his phone number is such, and his zip code is such. And how do we want to say to our e-commerce platform that this drop shipper is eligible for a discount that our John Doe is not? Well, there's a couple ways to do this, right? We could probably have a table that says discount amount and give it, some flat value here, and that would be our percentage off. This is something we could do. You probably would never want to do this, but you could do this. What happens if we have a new customer, Jane Doe, and we want to give her a specific discount amount? Well, we're always going to have to duplicate the value of that discount amount for every single customer. And while that's somewhat powerful in that every single customer can have a different discount amount, it duplicates a lot of information in this table that's not really important. We could change discount amounts en masse just by changing how the discounts are associated. And that's how we wind up normalizing some information out of the table, and we wind up with something that actually describes a customer group. Okay, so follow me here, because we're working our way to why we have EAV. So we'll wind up with something like a group ID. We're going to have a group ID 1 and a group ID 2. That means we probably need a table to describe customer group. Let's say customer group. And that's probably going to have an ID and maybe a label as well with it, right? So we'll have ID 1, ID 2. The label for group 1 will just be, registered customers, and group 2, well, they're drop shippers. Okay, well, let's say drop ship like that. Okay. So now we've described a customer group. Now we want to describe the discount for that customer group, okay? And so we're going to say discount, okay? And we'll have an ID on that as well. We always do. and maybe we want to say what group ID is associated with this discount, and maybe we want to say the amount of the discount here. Okay, so now we're going to describe that all registered customers will have a discount of 10%. And let's say that we want all dropship customers to have a discount of, I don't know, let's say 25%. Okay. Now what we've described is the ability for us to change a group association to a customer at any time and give them a new discount. Also, we can create a discount that that will apply to all customers. So if we ever needed to modify this discount to change this to 5%, all customers associated with that group would now receive a new discount amount. Okay, so now we've described a little bit of normalization here of the database that helps us to make sense of changes that don't need to be replicated inside of particular tables. Now, how do we arrive at EAV? Well, let's take this out one step further, okay? And let's say that we wanted to create a special field that is unique to dropshippers only, okay? And maybe a dropshipper wants to have some information associated with their product that is something like a vendor name, okay? That might be something important. And this dropshipper might have a particular vendor they use, and let's call that vendor name Shippytown. Why not? The problem that arises here is that we could wind up with a whole host of vendor-specific information in our customer table that really only has to do with dropshippers. Now, what happens if we wind up with more columns in our database that's specific only to regular registered customers, like date of birth, right? Well, the dropshipper is a business entity and doesn't really have a date of birth, right? That doesn't make any sense for them. So you're going to wind up having fields that are specific, and this is what is important about EAV, if you understand, is that the attribute that we're describing in this column is specific to only one type of entity and not to another. Okay, now in this case they both happen to be customers, and maybe this is not the best example. So what do we have here? We have a date of birth, we have a vendor name, and a vendor ship date. Well, these can actually be normalized out as well, okay? And this is where we wind up gravitating naturally towards EAV, in that we probably want to have an attribute table, okay? And our attribute table will describe different types of attributes and which entities or which types of data they are associated with, okay? So let's do this. Let's create an ID, let's give it a label, and that's all we need for now, okay? So let's do that. So let's say attribute 1, okay, attribute ID 1 is a date of birth. And let's say attribute ID 2 is a vendor name. And let's say attribute 3 is a vendor ship date. All right, so we've now described attributes. How do we now describe values for those attributes? Well, you've guessed it, we're going to have a values table. Let's make it singular. We're going to have a value table, okay? And our value table needs to reference which attribute ID it's describing as a value, and we're going to have a value column. Okay, so follow me now. The value ID column, all of these are just auto increment columns. So this column is an ID here, and the attribute ID that we're describing is date of birth, okay? Now we need to reference what entity ID this is applicable to, so we're going to insert another column. Okay, great. So for customer number 1, we're going to have a date of birth attribute with a value of 1/11 or 1/1/2001. And you see right now we don't need to enter another row with null values for our dropshipper, so we can take this column out. This is EAV. This is all there is to it. You could easily rename customer to entity, but we'll do that in just a moment. let's go on and do dropshipper. So for entity ID number 2, for that customer ID number 2, we have an attribute ID of vendor name, which is 2, and we're going to give it a value of Shippytown. Let's just type it, Shippytown. How's that? Okay. So now we've actually given that a value, so let's delete that. Vendor ship date is also possible. So for entity number 2, we want to have an attribute of ID 3, the vendor ship date, and we want to give it a value of all items will ship at the end of the year. Okay, so now you see the power of what we've done, is that anytime, let's move this column out, here we go. Anytime we want to describe new information about a customer, we don't need to issue an alter statement. So this is a very important part of why you use EAV, is to change the schema. You don't require altering tables to add new columns. There's also no duplication or unrelated information that's needing to be duplicated across different entity types. Okay? Now we take it a step further and we can say, for performance reasons, if the entity table, if our customer table got very, very large, and let's say it was hundreds of millions of records long, which is possible, an alter statement to add a column would be very costly and result in a lot of downtime. It's a very tough thing to do. Instead, what EAV attempts to do is you can insert a new attribute, and insert is very quick, right? And you can insert a new value for that attribute, and all of a sudden, you have that ability, provided your application understands how to assemble it, you have that ability or facility to add a new customer attribute or even remove it with no consequence or no downtime. Now, when I say no consequence, you have to understand that there is a consequence, because all of this is very costly for performance, because it requires at least 2 queries. One query to get all attributes and values and entities, and then another query to assemble those into a usable format in a way that's actually parsable or usable by your application. So to assemble what attributes and values are available for an entity is one query, and then to put it all together is another query. And that can be pretty costly and require many, many joins. You can actually take this further, because value right now is only a specific type of information. You see we've already duplicated, or we've already kind of fuzzied things up here a little bit. There's no type checking right here of this value. You see we have 2 date values and we have 1 varchar value. And what Magento decided to do to enforce a little bit of that data integrity, because it's very important that the data store has the right data type for what you're storing. What Magento has done is to provide additional levels of value tables and to provide ones for each entity type. So Magento has taken it upon itself to have a datetime attribute value, datetime attribute value and a varchar attribute value. And that means, actually let's move datetime up here, move less out here, and varchar. And all we need here, whoops. Now we have actually, we can actually specify that the value column on the datetime table, okay, we're just taking it one step further and saying instead of 1 value table, we have many. And depending on the type, right, depending on the data type of the table, we're knowing that we need to join on the datetime table, and then a varchar table, and an int table, right, and a float table, and a text type table. And you can see now how many queries it's actually going to take to assemble this data. And that's why Magento took the next step, okay, and Magento's next step was to create a flat table. And the flat table does all of that query and indexing, they call it indexing, all at one time to assemble it together so that you have all the information in one big flat table, so all queries can be done with a single select. Okay, but more on that in a future episode. So what's next? What if we don't just have customers? What if we have products as well? Okay, let's attempt to describe a product. Let's make that a singular. All right. And now let's say I have an ID. Okay, and my product maybe has a SKU, and maybe it has a price. And, price could also be an attribute value, could be modeled in EAV, but we don't necessarily need it to be. Okay, let's hide customer group and discount for now, because they're kind of cluttering up our definition here, and it was just helping us to understand why you wouldn't just normalize this information, or what normalization looks like actually. So we have a product, and let's say it's product ID number 1, and let's say it's SKU test 001, and let's say it has a price of $5, okay? Well, I want to provide an attribute for this, and I want it to be a product name, okay? So we could do that. Let's have an attribute of 4, attribute ID 4, and we're going to call this a product name attribute, and let's insert, because it's a varchar type, okay? Let's insert, I guess you would have a data type field. I mean, this is potentially how you could do this. Date time. Actually, you would probably normalize that as well. Let's not extend it out logically too much, but let's just assume that our application understands what each of these do. You would probably have a column that describes it and a lookup table so that you knew which table to use. That's for another episode. But for our product that we're describing, we want a product name. So let's enter a varchar, okay? Let's enter a varchar value. And what is our entity ID now? Well, for our product table, it's 1, right? And for our attribute ID, it's 4. And our value for our product name just needs to be test product. How's that? Now you can probably see where I'm going to go here, in that entity ID is ambiguous in this table. It doesn't mean anything because I have another type. My product name is not necessarily the same as my customer name. And my product name really only applies to products. It doesn't apply to anything else. And that's where we need to add one more level, and that is to describe an entity type. An entity type would have an ID and a name. Okay? I guess we've been calling that label. Let's call it a label. And an entity type is described as what is the type of entity in this table that's being described by the data type value that I'm using. Okay, so follow me now. Product needs to have an entity type associated with it. Customer needs to have an entity type associated with it. So let's say entity type 1 is a customer. Okay, let's move this over here. Boom. And let's say entity type 2 is a product. How do we identify for our attributes and for our values which entity type is associated to which? It's very easy. Actually, let's not call it entity type ID. Let's just call it type ID. How's that? A date of birth type ID belongs to what? A customer. The vendor name belongs to a customer. Ship date belongs to a customer. But the product name belongs to a product. Now we need to take this one step further because we need to be able to do a join for all attributes and their values, right? So what do we need here? We don't just need an entity ID, we need an entity type ID. So let's insert a column and let's say type ID. Okay, what type of ID is this date time associated with? Well, this just happens to be for a customer. Both of these happen to be for a customer, but there could be date times associated with a product. Like, we could actually, let's go ahead and do that. Let's insert an attribute, and let's say that its product would be special from date. The product is on special from a certain date. Okay, this is going to be for a type ID 2. And we need to insert another record. Let's say date time. It's for what entity? It's for entity 1 of type what? 2, product, right? Product 2. So it's product ID 1 and type ID 2 for product. And which attribute ID are we describing? 5. And what will our special date be? Let's say our product goes on special January 1st, 2016. Okay, so I hope you're following me here because we're going to do one more. And let's do a varchar. varchar needs to have a type ID. So let's insert a record or insert a column and move it to the right. And we're going to have a type ID. And let's say, what is the type ID of Shippytown? Well, Shippytown was for dropshipper vendor name. Okay, so this is for entity 2 and type ID 1 because it's a customer. Test product, however, was for a product, and that's a name of a product. Remember what our attribute ID 4 was a product name. So what type ID is it? Type 2. And really, you can make it more complicated if you like. But at the end of the day, this is all that EAV is a storage method that requires, we've arrived now at how we came together, came up with EAV, and we did it organically by working from one table and then taking a next step and a next logical conclusion of how would I normalize this information that requires no alters or updates to my table, but can still describe entity attributes that have values that aren't necessarily related to every entity type. I hope you understood this. I really do, because I cannot think of a better way to describe it than this. In a future series, we're going to see how this actually plays out in Magento, and I can't wait to show that to you. Cheers.